Okay, cool. So this is some work that I've done with the help of a student at Waikato, JP, and under supervision of Richard Nelson. Basically looking at traffic for internet applications that basically masquerades as something else at the transport layer. So this all sort of comes about because we like to use port-based traffic control. So we're talking things like your firewall rules and your really simplistic traffic classification schemes, right? And the reason that we do this, of course, is because it's easy to implement in hardware, it's easy to understand. We like to do stuff with port numbers, we know what it means when we say block this port number, allow this port number, this sort of thing. And of course, many years ago now, we've realized that not all of the applications that we see on the internet can be easily identified by their port number. In particular, peer-to-peer came along and was quite good at trying to hide itself by choosing random port numbers. But it's not all bad, right? Because we can still sort of whitelist the applications that we know are desirable because we know that they're going to run on very specific port numbers. And this is sort of underpinned by a few rather naive assumptions, and that is that the IANA port number assignments are sacred and no one would dare borrow an already assigned port number. And in particular, those port numbers below 102.4 should be especially safe because you have to have certain privileges to even be able to open a socket on them, right? But it turns out that if you are a young application designer looking to make the next big thing, there are plenty of reasons for you to borrow TCP port 80. In particular, the firewall is more likely to be open to you if you are operating on port 80, and your traffic flows often can be obscured in amongst all the other stuff that's appearing on there. And the network engineers also will see a big flow on port 80 perhaps, and they won't be too alarmed because that's just normal HTTP traffic, right? So we already know, right, that not all TCP port 80 traffic is HTTP. There have been plenty of studies in the past. But what these studies failed to address was, what was that traffic? What was actually doing this stuff, right? So this leads to a few fairly obvious questions. And the first one is, can we identify these other applications? You know, what are these things that people are running that are sneaking past our port-based traffic controls? You know, how many of these applications are there? Do we see this sort of behavior on other port numbers? I mean, people have only so far really looked at port 80. What about 443? What about DNS? What about NTP? What about the HTTP alternate ports? And in particular, we also want to consider both TCP and UDP, right? Because it's just as likely that you could try and hide something on UDP port 80 with the hope of it slipping past someone's careful gaze. Are these applications things that we should be worried about? You know, are these being used for some sort of malicious purpose or to sneak something onto our system? Or is it really just, you know, making life easier for guys at work who want to play some games during their lunch hour and not have any IT guys notice? How much of this traffic is there? How many people are using it? Are we talking about, you know, one or two people just playing around, or is this something that's a general use case? And finally, can we automate the identification of these applications, right? We don't want to have to sit there manually inspecting the payload of these flows to find them. Can we develop some rules and improve the state of traffic classification along the way? So here's what I did. So I took the uplink from our campus network to the rest of the internet. There is, of course, a firewall and an edge router at the border. And just outside of that edge router, we were able to connect an Endace probe, which is capable of capturing and recording every single packet that comes into and goes out of the university network. Because I am an ethical researcher, we then went and truncated most of that payload. We only kept 4 bytes of application level payload, as well as the TCP IP headers or UDP IP headers. And we encrypted the local IP addresses to protect the privacy of the students and staff on campus. And finally, we took those encrypted and truncated packets and wrote them to packet trace files for subsequent analysis. And how we analyzed them was we took a library that we developed at WAND called libprotoident. It is a lightweight packet inspection library. And the key point of libprotoident over other sort of DPI style tools is that it only requires 4 bytes of application payload per packet. So we can operate on those truncated packets I was talking about earlier. We also ignore every packet that isn't the first payload bearing packet in each direction for a flow. So we're only analyzing maybe 15 to 20% of the packets in our trace file. As of the most recent release of libprotoident, we've got support for about 300 different application protocols. And it's open source, so anyone can download and use it. Included with the library is a simple tool called LPI protoident. What it does is you can run against a trace or a live packet capture, and it will just spit out every single network flow that it sees. So the 5-tuple, start and end times, byte counts for each direction, as well as the application that libprotoident thinks was the source of that flow. It also displays the first 4 bytes of payload that it saw in each direction. This is mainly useful for helping me when I'm trying to figure out what the unknown flows are. I've got something to reference back to. For our study, we were careful to ignore all of the flows in which the local endpoint didn't participate. So if there was an incoming TCP SYN, but there was no resulting SYNAC coming out from the local site, then that was ignored. Mainly just to try and get rid of all the scans and backscatter and other things that aren't really likely to be passing through a real firewall or a real port-based traffic control. So we captured about 7 days of the university's traffic in September 2015, ran it against an older version of libprotoident, and our initial test run produced quite a few unknown flows. So rather than just giving up and saying, all right, well, there's 50% of this stuff is unknown, our new goal became, let's look into this a bit more closely and see if we can figure out what the hell this stuff is. So I'll just go over briefly the general method that I used. So basically it's a bit of scripting to sort our unknown flows, figure out which payload patterns are contributing the most bytes, then go back and search through our unknown flows for all of the flows that match that particular pattern of interest, and then look for common elements within those flows that might give us some sort of idea as to what the application might be. So that might be an IP for a server that crops up a lot, or it might be that there's a port number that crops up quite often that would maybe be a starting point for our search. If we get any common elements out of that, we start basically just doing a whole bunch of searching of databases to see what we can find, any sort of reference as to what application might be involved. So if we've pulled out a common server IP address, then we might do a whois lookup, might try and do a reverse DNS, might type it into Google, see if there's any mention of it anywhere on the internet as being a server for some game or some chat program. Same thing with the port numbers, do some Google searches, try and find any sort of hint that we can get as to what application might be the source of that traffic that we're starting to see quite often. Hopefully that will lead us to the identity of a potential candidate application. But that's obviously not enough evidence for us to be able to say that that pattern belongs to that application. So we then have to go and download and install the application on one of our testbed machines. They're all basically little sandbox type machines, or an emulator for a mobile device in the case of mobile-only apps. We capture the traffic while we are using the application, trying to use it in as many different ways as possible. We use our own libtrace software to do the capture if we can, but for Windows-only applications, we had to fall back to WinDump. And then with that captured trace of us using the application, we can run that back through our LPI protoident tool. If we start to see the same flows with those same patterns appearing in our output from that, then we've got a successful match. We've confirmed that the application was generating the traffic that we identified earlier. If we don't, then it's all the way back to the previous steps and start again. It's not as easy as I make it sound. And there's one big reason for a lot of that. So the first problem I have, I mentioned doing whois and reverse DNS lookups. China doesn't really believe in any of that stuff. So the IP address I've highlighted there at the top of the slide is a server that is used for the CanCan video streaming platform. But if you try to do, well, you can't do any reverse DNS on it. You just won't get a result. If you try to do a whois on it, then the only information you'll get back is that this is from some Chinese provincial network. It gives you no indication of the company involved or the service that's being served from that address. So there's nothing. It's useless information. Even if you do get a little bit of information out of China, if you're lucky enough, you tend to run into problems with big internet conglomerates. So in particular, you can look at the Tencent Corporation, which is very big in China. They have a lot of applications that they provide, and every single one of those applications provides its own unique protocol with its own unique definition and specification. And none of them are at all alike. And even worse is that sometimes you will get applications that use multiple different protocols for different features within the same application. So, for instance, WeChat has a different protocol for doing video conversations than it does for doing voice conversations. So what I've got here on the slide is the icons of a number of Tencent applications. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with any of them, but these are all unique, use their own protocols, and I've had to download and install them all to identify each of them. So finding out that Tencent is responsible for a particular flow is not necessarily a lot of help at all. Furthermore, there's a complete lack of public documentation for many of these protocols, and there's plenty of reasons for this. So if you're trying to make a popular game, then you might not want your players to get a hold of any information as to what the protocol is like, because they will use it to try and cheat. Peer-to-peer protocols will also not release too much information because they don't want people blocking it. Similarly, people like to come up with their own custom encryption schemes. They decide that TLS isn't enough for them, so they'll write their own. And even when somebody reverse engineers one of these protocols for you, it's probably someone on a random Chinese forum somewhere, and good luck actually finding any of that or understanding it, because Google Translate isn't too hot. On that note, even trying to use these applications can be pretty challenging if you don't understand any of the language at all. Also, the UIs are very busy, you may notice, so it can be quite hard to find any of the features that you're looking for. Right, so once I sort of endlessly repeated that cycle, I've been able to boil it down to a few basic numbers, which I've got here. So this is a table of the number of what I call unexpected bytes, so bytes for flows that don't match the expected protocol on that port. It's sorted by the total number of unexpected bytes seen on each port. So the port with the most unexpected bytes is TCP 443, it's got 89 gigabytes, but overall that's only a small percentage of the traffic that we saw on that port, so 0.7%. But you'll notice the next two below that, 8080 has quite a lot of unexpected bytes, both in terms of volume and in terms of percentage, so there's quite a lot of stuff that is hiding on there. And you sort of work your way down, you'll see that NTP's there at the bottom. Nobody's really trying to smuggle anything over NTP yet. So just to sum up some of the more interesting results that we got. So Quick is actually out there. It is big if you are willing to let people do traffic over UDP for port 4 for free, and by people I mean Perry, then they will do it to you, right? We saw 1.4 terabytes of Quick in that week. It was the third biggest protocol overall. Similarly, if you are wondering where all of your YouTube traffic has gone, and it's because you were looking for it on TCP. It might not be there anymore. It may have shifted to UDP. By contrast, Speedy, we observed it, but not in any real large volume. As you may have gathered, I saw quite a few Chinese applications. I'm pretty sure I haven't got them all. There will still be more out there. The important thing I think to get from this is that these weren't isolated cases either. This wasn't just one person who happened to, want to video stream over a particular platform or wanted to use a particular chat program. We were seeing, 100 plus local IP addresses who were all using these different protocols. And you can sort of draw your own inferences as to why Chinese applications like to try and use particular ports to get through firewalls. Might be some sort of history of firewalling or something in that country, I don't know. A bit more about what we saw on TCP port 80. So there were 46 unique non-HTTP applications on TCP port 80. The total was about 26 gigabytes of non-HTTP traffic over that week. The biggest one by volume was RTMP, which is not entirely surprising. That's just Flash that isn't over HTTP. And next three biggest were unknown, unfortunately, still. And then we also saw a protocol that was specific to Taobao, which is related to Alibaba, the online shopping from China. And then Spotify was also quite big, using their own custom protocol on port 80. 443, again, we saw a lot of non-HTTP applications, non-HTTPS, that should say, 43 of them, totaling nearly 90 gigabytes of traffic. Again, RTMP quite big, but the one that was in second place that was most interesting was unencrypted HTTP on TCP port 443. So there's a little bit of that around. They had the right idea, just not quite the right execution. 8080, like I mentioned earlier, was quite big, so there was 50 gigabytes of TCP port 8080 traffic that wasn't HTTP or anything like it. That was all the Zunlai peer-to-peer file sharing program, so look out for that. There was another 38 gigs on UDP. That was all mostly OpenVPN and a little bit of WeChat. So just see how much time I got. Oh, I'm starting to run low, but that's all right. So this is one of the more interesting behaviors that we observed as a result of this study. The Baidu web browser can do some interesting things on TCP port 80. So what happens is if you've installed the Baidu web browser, then in the background, it will periodically do this, where it will do a standard TCP handshake to the Baidu server. All right, makes sense. And then the client immediately sends a FIN. So we connected, and now we want to immediately disconnect. The server doesn't respond to these FINs, so we keep sending them up to about 5 more times. And then we'll send a packet with 1 byte of payload, but that 1 byte of payload will have the same sequence number as the original SYN that we sent. So it's a TCP keep alive. We're checking if the connection's up. Someone sends a reset, and then it all just falls over. I don't know what the point of this is, but we saw it a lot. Right? There were about 150,000 of these flows and 1,800 different unique local IPs on campus that we observed this behavior on. It was bursty, but there wasn't really a consistent frequency, so you'd get clients would just burst out about 20 or so of these flows to the Baidu servers, and then 5 minutes later it would do it again, and then 15 minutes later it would do it again, and then 5 minutes later it would do it again. Right? And we confirmed this. We installed the Baidu browser on a very isolated sandbox PC and captured this behavior and saw it. I don't know what this is for. I assume it's some sort of phone home mechanism or something like that, because there is literally no data being transferred by this connection. Okay, so to sum up, I asked some questions. What are the answers? Can we identify the unexpected traffic? Yeah, most of it. I mean, there's a little bit left, but we've got the vast majority of it. Are other ports affected by this sort of behavior? Everything except 123. 443, 8080 in particular were affected. Is this stuff a security threat, or is it more a nuisance value? Most of the applications I was looking at, it was more about user convenience than anything else, right? Making your chat program work, making something else just work in the presence of a lot of firewalls and port-based traffic controls. So it's more about avoiding detection and getting through and ensuring connectivity than, you know, trying to hack the Gibson or whatever. Bytes and user counts, the proportion overall might be quite small, but I would definitely say that the volume was non-trivial. There's definitely a bit of stuff out there. And these applications were being used by quite a few people. Were we able to automate the identification? Yeah, we added new libprotident rules for 22 applications as a result of this study. 10 more applications got better rules that enabled them to match more traffic. And the neat thing about this is most of the new applications that we found weren't covered by existing DPI engines, open source ones, or even including the one on the Endace probe. So there's a couple of final caveats. We only measured the University of Waikato campus network. The mix of things might be different on a corporate network versus a residential network versus even another campus. I get the suspicion that the demographics do matter a bit in terms of the overall volumes. We've got a reasonably high proportion of our student population coming from China or Taiwan, so maybe that's where we get a bit of a bias towards observing those Chinese applications. But on the other hand, these applications exist, they're using those ports. It doesn't really matter so much the exact specifics of the proportions, but the fact that they exist is maybe something you want to be aware of. If you want to read more about this research, there was a paper on it published at the Internet Measurement Conference last year, so you can look at that paper, look at the full numbers. If you want to play around with libprotident, then that's also freely available, or you can get in touch with me and ask any questions. But I'll take a few now if I have a little bit of time. Thank you. Yes, over the back there.
Do you get a sense of any false positives in the magic number matching for the protocols? The assumption I'm guessing from what you said is if you match on the magic number, then it's all the protocol. Do you think that's 100% true?
I should explain that there's a little bit more going on than just matching purely those 4 bytes. We often look at the size of that first payload-bearing packet as well, so that can often provide us with a bit more specific information. Yeah, there's always going to be a small chance of false positives. I do the best I can to write the rules so that they're as specific as possible, and try and do a bit of double checking to make sure that I haven't suddenly matched, 100,000 flows that were previously unknown or were previously something else, which is even worse. So yeah, there's the potential for false positives, but I'm fairly confident they're pretty small. Yeah. We were looking at both directions. Not in terms of related to the university network, but as far as what I was thinking in terms of not worrying too much about direction is that we're just as likely to be a source of attack traffic as we are to be a recipient, because we have a lot of students who are just basically sitting there on our wireless network doing whatever, right? They could have installed all sorts of horrible malware that causes them to be the attacker rather than the attackee. Anyone else? Can't see anyone, so the lights are quite blinding over there, so it sucks to be you guys.